I still get chills thinking about that night at the old cemetery. It was supposed to be just another adventurous evening with my friends. You know, the kind of stupid stuff college kids do when they're bored on a Saturday night. There were 4 of us: Mike, Sarah, Jenny, and me. Mike had this brilliant idea of having a midnight picnic in the cemetery, claiming it would be aesthetic, with all the Victorian headstones and ancient oak trees. The cemetery was actually quite beautiful in an eerie sort of way. Moonlight filtered through the ancient oaks, casting intricate shadows on the weathered tombstones. We found a clear spot near the center, spread out our blanket, and set up our little feast. Sandwiches, chips, and yes, quite a bit of alcohol. The first couple of hours were actually fun. We played truth or dare, shared ghost stories, and laughed at our own jumpiness whenever a twig snapped in the distance. The old cemetery didn't seem so scary with friends around and some liquid courage in our systems. Around midnight, nature called. I told my friends I needed to take a leak and walked toward a cluster of trees near the eastern section of the cemetery. As I was about to do my business, I noticed something moving in my peripheral vision. About 50 yards away, I saw what appeared to be a woman in white, just standing there among the graves. At first, I thought it was just Sarah or Jenny playing a prank. But then I realized I could still hear their voices chatting and laughing in the distance behind me. Curiosity got the better of me. Blame it on the beer if you want. And I decided to investigate. As I got closer, my heart started pounding harder. Something wasn't right. The woman was wearing what looked like a hospital gown, and I could see dark stains on it that looked disturbingly like blood in the moonlight. She was just wandering aimlessly between the graves, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. I should have turned back right then, but my feet kept moving forward as if drawn by some invisible force. When I was about 20 feet away, she suddenly stopped. Slowly, she turned toward me, and I felt my blood freeze. Her face was pale as chalk, but what really terrified me were her eyes. They were completely white, no iris, no pupils, just an empty whiteness that seemed to glow in the dark for what felt like an eternity. We just stared at each other. Then her mouth opened, far wider than any human mouth should be able to, and she let out a scream that sounded like a combination of a banshee's wail and nails on a chalkboard. Before I could process what was happening, she started running toward me with that same unnatural movement, her head tilted at an impossible angle, those white eyes fixed on me. I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. I could hear her behind me, that horrible screaming getting closer and closer. In my panic, I didn't watch where I was going and tripped over a headstone, landing hard on my knee. The pain shot through my leg like electricity, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled to get up, and that's when I saw it. The name on the headstone I'd tripped over, Miriam Whitmore, 1962 to 1989. When I looked up, she was gone. The cemetery was silent again, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing and my friends calling my name in the distance. I sat there, trembling, until they found me, my knee bleeding, and my clothes covered in dirt and grass stains. Of course, they didn't believe me when I told them what happened. Mike suggested I'd had too much to drink. Sarah thought I'd seen a shadow and let my imagination run wild. And Jenny just looked worried about my knee. We packed up our stuff and left quickly, though I noticed they were walking a bit faster than necessary. I couldn't shake the experience off in the following weeks. The image of those white eyes haunted my dreams. The name on that headstone kept repeating in my mind, Miriam Whitmore. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to do some research. It took some digging and asking around, but what I found made my blood run cold. Miriam Whitmore had been a patient at the Old Town Psychiatric Hospital in the 1980s. She suffered from severe schizophrenia and was known for wandering the hospital halls at night, screaming about demons possessing her soul. According to one of the cemetery caretakers, she died under mysterious circumstances in 1989. Her body was found in the hospital's basement, wearing a bloody hospital gown. The most disturbing part? The coroner's report noted that her eyes had been completely white when they found her, with no visible iris or pupils. The medical examiner had never seen anything like it and couldn't explain the condition. The case was never fully solved. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself thinking about Miriam. Was she trying to tell me something? Was she warning me about something? Or was she just another lost soul trapped between this world and whatever comes next? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to know. What I do know is that I haven't been back to that cemetery since that night. My friends still think I imagined the whole thing, but they don't push for cemetery picnics anymore either. And sometimes when I'm driving past the cemetery late at night, I swear I can see a figure in white moving among the tombstones. And I hear a faint screaming in the distance. So if you're ever thinking about having a midnight picnic in a cemetery, take it from me. Some places should be left undisturbed, and some stories are better left untold. Because sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones we make up around a campfire. They're the ones that are true. The ones that follow us home and haunt us long after the night is over. As for Miriam Whitmore, I hope she's found peace. But on dark nights when the moon is full, I still check twice when I see movement in the shadows. And I never ever stop to investigate strange figures in white hospital gowns. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more terrifying stories. And if you have a chilling story of your own, let me know in the comments. And remember, some horrors are closer than you think. Stay tuned, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next story. I've been working as a morgue technician for over 7 years now, and nothing could have prepared me for what happened during that winter night shift 3 months ago. Most people think our job is perpetually creepy, but you get used to it. The deceased are just empty vessels, and we treat them with respect while helping pathologists determine their cause of death. At least, that's what I kept telling myself until that night. It was around 3 a.m., and I was alone in the facility. We usually work in pairs, but my colleague had called in sick, and being short-staffed is unfortunately common in our line of work. The night had been quiet, just routine paperwork and preparation for the morning shift's scheduled autopsies. I sat at my desk filling out forms. That's when the first anomaly occurred. The temperature monitoring system for the cold chambers started beeping, indicating a slight rise in temperature in chamber number 4. This happens occasionally due to mechanical issues, so I wasn't particularly concerned. I walked down the corridor to check the control panel. The temperature had risen from the standard 2 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius, not critical but definitely requiring attention. I made a note to inform maintenance in the morning and decided to transfer the body to another chamber just to be safe. Chamber 4 contained a John Doe who had been brought in the previous evening. The police found him in an abandoned building, and the preliminary report suggested a drug overdose. Nothing unusual about the case, except for the fact that he had no identification on him. I pulled out the tray, and that's when I noticed the first strange detail. The body bag had a small tear near the zipper, something that definitely wasn't there during intake. I distinctly remembered processing this body myself, and our bags are high quality and designed to prevent such tears. As I was about to unzip the bag to transfer the body, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint, barely audible, but it sounded like scratching coming from inside the bag. My rational mind immediately started making excuses. It was probably the zipper catching on something. Or maybe my tired brain was playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. The bag moved. It wasn't the subtle movement you sometimes see from gas release, which is common in deceased bodies. This was different, more deliberate, like someone trying to stretch within a confined space. I've dealt with plenty of unsettling situations before. We occasionally get bodies in various states of decomposition or trauma, but nothing had ever made me feel this kind of primal fear. My hands were shaking as I reached for the zipper, knowing I had to verify what I was seeing. Just as my fingers touched the metal zipper pull, the lights flickered. In our facility, we have backup generators that kick in automatically, so complete darkness is nearly impossible. But at that moment, the entire morgue went pitch black. Even the emergency lights failed to activate. I froze. In the absolute darkness, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then I heard something else. The distinct sound of a zipper being opened slowly, but it wasn't by my hand. I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight, dropping it in my panic. The sound of it clattering on the floor echoed through the morgue. As I bent down to retrieve it, I felt a cold draft brush against my face, accompanied by the unmistakable smell of decay. When I finally managed to turn on my phone's flashlight, the beam revealed the body bag was now open. The John Doe was still lying there, but his position had changed. His head was turned toward me, eyes still closed, but his arm was hanging off the side of the tray in an unnatural position. I'd like to say I acted professionally, that I maintained my composure and followed protocol. Instead, I backed away slowly. Phone's light trained on the body. That's when his eyes opened. They weren't the clouded, lifeless eyes of a corpse. They were alert, focused, and looking directly at me. What happened next occurred so quickly that I still have trouble processing it. The body sat up with a fluid movement that no deceased person should be capable of. Its jaw opened wider than humanly possible, releasing a sound that I can only describe as a mix between a gasp and a growl. I ran. I dropped my phone and ran as fast as I could toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear the metallic sound of the tray being pushed aside, followed by the wet slap of bare feet on the floor. The emergency exit was about 30 meters away, and I covered that distance in what felt like seconds. As I burst through the door into the stairwell, the emergency lights suddenly came back on. The door slammed behind me, and I heard the electronic lock engage. I stood there in the stairwell, gasping for breath, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. It took 20 minutes for security to respond to my calls. When they arrived with the facility manager, we found everything in perfect order. The body was in its bag, properly positioned on the tray. My phone was on my desk, though I distinctly remembered dropping it in the cold chamber room. The temperature monitoring system showed no record of any malfunction. The security footage from that night was completely normal. It showed me checking the temperature panel, but then there's a 10-minute gap, attributed to a power surge that apparently affected the entire block. The footage resumes with me sitting at my desk, looking visibly shaken. The John Doe was autopsied the next morning by the chief pathologist. Cause of death was confirmed as a drug overdose, and the body was eventually claimed by distant relatives. There were no unusual findings noted in the autopsy report. I requested a transfer to day shifts after that night, but I still work in the morgue. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the facility, I can swear I hear scratching sounds coming from the cold chambers. The other staff members say it's just the ventilation system, but I know better. The strangest part? A week after the incident, I was organizing some paperwork when I found something that made my skin crawl. It was the original intake form for our John Doe. The time of death was estimated at 3:15 a.m., exactly the same time I had encountered him in the morgue. But he had been brought in the previous evening, supposedly already deceased. I never reported this discrepancy. Who would believe me? In our line of work, we deal with facts, with science, with the clear line between life and death. But that night showed me that maybe that line isn't as clear as we think it is. To this day, I keep wondering about that John Doe. Was he really dead when they brought him in? Was it all a hallucination brought on by too many night shifts and too little sleep? I don't have answers, but I do know one thing. I always double-check the body bags now, and I never, ever work alone in the cold chamber room. Some of my colleagues have noticed that I'm more cautious now, that I insist on certain protocols being followed to the letter. They probably think I'm being overly careful, but they weren't there that night. They didn't see what I saw, and they don't hear the scratching sounds that sometimes echo through the morgue at night. Sounds that make me wonder if death is really as final as we think it is. I've worked as a cemetery groundskeeper for a couple of years now, and most of what I do is mundane. Mowing lawns, trimming hedges, maintaining pathways, and occasionally helping the gravediggers. The night shift isn't exactly coveted, but it pays better, and I've grown accustomed to the solitude. At least, I thought I had until 3 months ago. Let me be clear. I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. My job has taught me that cemeteries are peaceful places, more like parks than the spooky settings you see in horror movies. But what happened that night wasn't supernatural. In some ways, it was worse. It started during my regular patrol around 1:30 a.m. Our cemetery is fairly large, about 40 acres, with sections dating back to the 1800s. We've had issues with vandals and teenagers sneaking in at night, so we do regular checks. I was driving the maintenance cart along the eastern perimeter when I noticed something odd. Fresh tire tracks in the mud near the maintenance shed. This wasn't unusual in itself. Funeral directors and workers come and go all the time. But these tracks were recent, and there hadn't been any burials scheduled that day. More importantly, they didn't match our maintenance vehicles. I radioed Carl, the other night shift worker, who was supposed to be watching the security cameras. "Hey, did anyone come through the main gate in the last hour?" Static answered me. This wasn't entirely unusual. Our radios were old, and reception could be spotty in certain areas. I decided to check the maintenance shed first, thinking maybe the day shift had forgotten to log a delivery. As I approached the shed, I noticed the padlock was still secured, but then I saw something that made me stop. Fresh cigarette butts scattered near the back corner, along with muddy footprints leading into the older section of the cemetery. I clicked my radio again. Still static. I should have called the police right then, but I'd dealt with trespassers before. Usually, it was just kids trying to scare each other or vandals looking to steal metal decorations from graves. I decided to investigate first, not wanting to bother the police if it wasn't necessary. Following the footprints, I noticed they were made by at least 3 different people. They led to the Victorian section, where the graves are older and the monuments more elaborate. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to track them between the headstones. The footprints stopped near a large family mausoleum, one of those ornate stone buildings with columns and stained glass windows. What caught my attention was the van parked behind it, partially hidden by overgrown shrubbery. It was a white utility van, the kind contractors use, with no markings or company name. I kept my distance and pulled out my phone to call the police. No signal. This wasn't unusual in some parts of the cemetery where the older monuments interfered with reception. I decided to return to my cart and use the radio to call for backup. That's when I heard it. The distinct sound of metal scraping against stone, coming from inside the mausoleum. I switched off my flashlight and moved closer, staying behind a large monument. The mausoleum door was slightly ajar, and I could see flashlight beams moving inside. Then I heard voices, speaking in low tones. "Hurry up with that one. The old ones are worth more. This marble's thicker than you said. We need the bigger saw." I realized what I was witnessing: grave robbers, but not the usual kind looking for jewelry or metalwork. These people were stealing parts of the monuments themselves. I'd read about this. Organized groups targeting historic cemeteries for their marble and stonework, selling them to unscrupulous contractors or overseas buyers. I started backing away slowly, planning to get to my cart and call for help. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. "Someone's here. Their cart's by the shed. Find them. We're not getting caught over this." I heard footsteps spreading out among the graves. They were between me and my cart, and I knew this section of the cemetery too well to think I could outrun them to the main gate. I did the only thing I could. I climbed into one of the larger family plots, hiding behind a chest-high monument. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I could hear them searching methodically through the grounds, their flashlight beams sweeping across the graves. One passed within feet of my hiding spot. I caught a glimpse of him, work clothes, face obscured by a dust mask, carrying something that looked more like a pry bar than a flashlight. These weren't vandals or thrill-seeking teens. These were professionals who came prepared and wouldn't want witnesses. I tried to control my breathing as footsteps crunched on gravel nearby. "Check the maintenance shed," one of them called out. They might have called it in already. I heard the van's engine start. They were getting ready to leave, but first, they wanted to make sure they wouldn't be followed. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing. A flashlight beam swept over my hiding spot. I pressed myself against the cold stone, praying the shadow would be enough. The beam passed by, then suddenly swung back. "Over here," one of them echoed. I ran. Not toward the gate or my cart, but deeper into the cemetery. I knew these grounds intimately, every path, every shortcut, every maintenance access point. They didn't. I could hear them pursuing, their footsteps echoing off the monuments. I ducked through a row of old cedar trees, then down into the lower grounds where we had a drainage culvert. The entrance was hidden behind overgrown bushes, something I only knew about because I'd had to clear it last spring. I squeezed into the concrete pipe, trying to control my panicked breathing. Footsteps pounded overhead. Flashlight beams played across the bushes but didn't penetrate the foliage. "Where'd they go?" one of them echoed. "Forget it. Police could be here any minute. Let's move." I heard them running back toward the van. Moments later, an engine revved and tires squealed on gravel. Still, I waited in that cold, damp pipe for what felt like hours before I dared to move. When I finally emerged, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely key my radio. This time, it worked. Carl, do you copy?" Nothing but static. I ran to the security office, finding it empty. The monitors were dark. When I tried the computer, I discovered the cables had been cut. Carl was nowhere to be found. I used the landline to call the police. They arrived quickly, but the van was long gone. They found Carl in the bathroom, unconscious with a bump on his head. He recovered but remembered nothing except someone asking for directions through the security window, then everything going black. The police investigation revealed more than we expected. The thieves had been systematically targeting historic cemeteries across 3 states, stealing carved marble panels and architectural elements from mausoleums. Some pieces were worth thousands to collectors. They disabled our security system professionally. They knew exactly which wires to cut and when to strike. We upgraded our security after that. New cameras, better lighting, motion sensors. I switched to day shift for a while, but eventually went back to nights. The pay is still better, and someone needs to keep watch, but I'm more cautious now. I carry a better radio and a personal alarm. I pay attention to tire tracks and cigarette butts. Most importantly, I know now that the real threats in a cemetery aren't the dead. They're the living who see it as nothing but a source of profit. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I walk past that mausoleum they were robbing. The marble panel they were trying to steal is still there, though you can see the marks where they started cutting. I think about how well they had planned it, how easily they disabled our security, how prepared they were to deal with witnesses. The police never caught them. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, targeting other cemeteries. I wonder if they remember the witness who got away, or if I was just another close call in their operation. I still work nights, but I never patrol alone anymore. We always work in pairs now, keeping in regular radio contact. And when I see fresh tire tracks or cigarette butts, I don't investigate. I call the police immediately, because now I know that cemeteries aren't haunted by the dead. The real danger comes from the living who have no respect for them. I've worked in a morgue for close to 2 decades. By now, I've seen everything. Grieving families, unclaimed bodies, autopsies that revealed things no one should ever know. But nothing disturbed me quite like the night I nearly sent the wrong body for cremation. It was a slow evening, the kind I usually preferred. A couple of incoming cases from the hospital, but no tragic accidents, no gruesome crime scenes, just the usual old age, illness, death, in its natural form. I was alone in the morgue that night, as I often was. It wasn't unusual. Night shifts are quieter. The dead don't complain, and most of my work is routine. I had finished prepping a body for a scheduled cremation in the morning. An elderly man, no family, a John Doe. It was sad, but not uncommon. Unclaimed bodies get cremated after the legal waiting period. Just another step in the process. I wheeled him into the refrigeration unit, checked my paperwork one last time, and locked up. The morgue had a peculiar silence, different from any hospital ward. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. No beeping machines, no distant chatter, just the hum of the cooling system and the occasional creak of metal trays shifting under temperature changes. I was about to head to the break room when I noticed something odd. The cooler door was slightly ajar. That was impossible. I always double-check. Always. A chill ran down my arms as I stepped closer. Had I been careless? No. I knew. I had locked it. My mind immediately tried to rationalize. Maybe the latch was faulty. Maybe the shift in pressure caused it to pop open. But I'd never seen that happen before. I pulled the door open wider and peered inside. Everything looked normal at first. Rows of stainless steel trays, numbered tags hanging from each. The body I had just stored was still there, but then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. The body had moved. Not much, just slightly. His head, which I had placed straight, was now tilted to the side. His hands, once resting on his stomach, had slipped down just enough to be unnatural. I froze, my mind scrambling for logic. Bodies don't move on their own. Sometimes rigor mortis causes slight shifts. But this felt different. It felt deliberate. I swallowed hard and stepped back, forcing myself to shake off the nerves. Maybe I had misremembered his position. Maybe I was just tired. I shut the cooler door firmly, making sure it latched this time, and left the morgue to clear my head. 15 minutes later, I returned, determined to finish my shift without letting my imagination get the better of me. I went over the next day's schedule, checking the list of bodies to be prepped. That's when I noticed something that made my breath hitch. The cremation paperwork. It wasn't for the John Doe. It was for another man. A different body entirely. A clerical mistake. If I had sent the wrong body to the crematorium, there would have been no way to undo it. No way to correct the mistake. The real John Doe would have remained in storage, while an entirely different person, a man whose family was expecting a burial, would have been turned to ashes. A sick feeling curled in my stomach. I had almost made a huge mistake, but as I reached for the correct file, something else caught my eye. The John Doe's tag, it was missing. Each body has a tag attached to the wrist, duplicated on the tray. But his was gone, vanished. I felt a creeping unease. I had checked it earlier. It had been there. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled open the cooler door once again, half expecting something to be different. And it was. The body wasn't there. I stared at the empty tray, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. There was no way. No way. My gut twisted. My pulse pounded in my ears. The body couldn't have moved on its own. I turned, scanning the room as if expecting to see him standing somewhere. But of course, that was ridiculous. Dead men don't stand. Dead men don't walk away. I checked the logbook, the security feed. No one had come in. No one had taken the body. It was just gone. I stood there for what felt like forever, my breath coming shallow and uneven. Had someone come in while I stepped out? But why would they take him? Nothing made sense. Then, a noise. A soft, dragging sound. My throat tightened. It was coming from the hallway. Slow, uneven, like footsteps, but heavier. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just stood there, listening. The sound passed the morgue entrance, continuing down toward the loading dock, the area where bodies were delivered or removed. I should have checked, should have followed, but something in me refused. Instead, I waited until the sound faded. Then, as if nothing had happened, the refrigeration unit gave a soft hiss as the cooling system adjusted. The hum returned. The silence wrapped around me again. I never found out what happened to that body. There were no security breaches, no missing reports. The cremation proceeded the next day, with the correct body this time. But to this day, I wonder, did I almost cremate a man who wasn't supposed to die? Or did someone realize the mistake before I did? And if so, who took him? And where did he go?